Good afternoon and welcome to this event sponsored by the Willson Center for Humanities and Art at the University of Georgia. This is part of the center's Global Georgia Initiative and an event as part of African American History Month. This talk is also co-sponsored by the Department of Philosophy and the Institute for African American Studies. I'm Chris Cuomo. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department and affiliate faculty member in Women's Studies and African American Studies. And I am so delighted and excited to be welcoming Femi Táíwò today. Femi Táíwò is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He received his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Los Angeles. And he works in the areas of ethical theory, political philosophy, Africana philosophy, and also feminist philosophy. His book, Reconsidering Reparations, was published by Oxford University Press last year, and his new book, Elite Capture, was recently released. He's published many essays on a range of important philosophical issues. They're all listed on his website, but he's also a very engaged public philosopher who regularly contributes to The Nation, Dissent, The New Republic, and many other print and online outlets. We're delighted that he's here today, virtually, but also in our hearts, to present the talk, Reconsidering Reparations. We'll have time for some questions and afterwards, so please use the Q&A function to send questions, and I will share them with Femi at the end of the talk. So stay around for the discussion. And now please join me in welcoming Femi Táíwò.
Thank you, Professor Cuomo. Thanks to the whole department and UGA for setting this up and giving me the opportunity to talk to everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm really glad to get to talk about this issue. And I think one thing that I like to say at the beginning is that there really is reason for thinking that we can do this. There's reason for a perspective other than nihilism and pessimism about both the topics of racial justice and climate justice, which I'm going to argue in a moment for a link between. But I think there's a perspective available to us of confronting the scale of those challenges other than pessimism or despair. And if I convince you of nothing else, I hope I give you a sense of that. What the book tries to accomplish that I'm here to talk about is it essentially argues for these two big claims. First, that the right view of reparations, or the best view about reparations, is that reparations is a constructive project. It means remaking the world. And it argues for a particular implication of that way of thinking about reparations, that means climate justice in the 21st century. And everything I said at the beginning about why we should have hope immediately comes crashing into these, very lofty goals. But let me say a little bit about both why I understand the project in this way and also why I think we can succeed. First, I understand reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism in particular as world making because I understand that era of world history as world making. It built a racist world order. It built the world order in general that we live in. That's something that was constructed at a period, during a period of human history. And it's partially because I understand those historical epochs in that way that I task reparations with something of a similar size and scope and scale. But part of the reason that I think about it in this way, and also part of the reason why I'm not despairing about the size of this challenge, is because the world has already been remade in the direction of justice. Adam Getachu's World Making After Empire talks about the world-making perspective that the anti-colonial nationalist movements that followed in the decades after the Second World War had. Before the Second World War, the British Empire alone controlled a quarter of the world's population and landmass. Much of the world was under explicit formal colonial domination, and that colonial domination was ruled by an equally explicit form of racial apartheid. And that was rolled back in the decades following the Second World War. The number of member states in the United Nations almost tripled because there were so many successful anti-colonial nationalist movements. Now, those didn't win the entire battle for justice on a planetary scale, but it nevertheless was a major advance. And it shows that major advances are possible. But it also shows that we should have a planetary scope and scale for those advances as the nationalist movements of those decades have. So it's both an example of why we should succeed, but it's also where the view of reparations I have comes from, planetary view of justice. So what's the planetary view of injustice that reparations is responding to? In the book, I call it global racial empire, but what's on the left is the kind of thing that I'm trying to explain. It lists these two reports saying that hazardous waste sites, toxic waste sites were disproportionately located near Black and brown communities in the United States. It's not because there's any sort of conceptual connection between those demographic categories and the idea of toxic waste, but rather we live in an unequal social system, and that system is unequal in general. It's not merely unequal with respect to wealth and money, though those are very important aspects of inequality, but it is generally unequal. So on the right is the kind of generalization that I explained in the second chapter of the book. The global social structure that resulted from transatlantic slavery and colonialism, I call it global racial empire. It's also been called racial capitalism. It can be understood as a set of processes that constitute a distributive system. That distributive system has these features: social advantages, things like wealth, but also things like cultural capital, things like research capacity, things like state capacity, accumulate disproportionately in the global north and in racially dominant communities across the world. And social disadvantages, things like poverty, but also things like toxic waste, accumulate in the global south and in racially disadvantaged communities. And this is something that holds up within and across political communities, within and across countries. There are libraries full of social science results that have tipped me towards this conclusion. But this is the way that I'm proposing that we think about the world. And because I'm proposing that we think about the world in this sense, then racial injustice is also a matter of actual distributions of actual things. The distribution of security, housing security, security with respect to food, energy, and water, distributions of political power, who controls major institutions and what those institutions control. And of course, distributions of resources, like ownership of housing, for example, and money. Those distributions are the concrete manifestation of racial injustice. And changing how these things are distributed is key to racial justice. So it's not changing the abstract principles by which we evaluate institutions, but it's changing their actual behavior in terms of these distributions. So armed with that perspective about the past and the present, I propose standards for evaluating reparations arguments and use them to explain why I think the constructive view is the best view of reparations, or why I think it gets some things done that alternative views don't. The first is that reparations for global racial empire should make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. It's not just, the fact that there is a floating moral obligation out there, but it's the ongoing carnage and damage of global racial empire that makes the moral difference to us. That's the reason why reparations is important and not just something that is in fact owed. But also, reparations for global racial empire should address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism to the extent possible. Unfortunately, given the timescales we're talking about, many people have died who were owed reparations. So there's kinds of reparations that are not available to us, but that shouldn't stop us from addressing the core moral wrongs that we can address. And finally, I think reparations for global racial empire should discriminate. How they distribute benefits and burdens should be based on different relationships of persons and institutions to the core moral wrong. Institutions that were extremely enriched or extremely complicit in global racial empire should have different responsibilities than corporations and countries that weren't. These standards are in order. So the first is the most important, the second is the second most important, and the third is the least important, and that will play a role in how I evaluate the arguments. I'm going to go through them just to put them on the table so that we can talk about them. There's a lot to say about all of them, but I'm looking forward to hearing from other people in Q&A. But I just want to make sure that we have this on the table to talk about. So one way of thinking about reparations is what's called the harm repair view, or what I've been calling the harm repair view. This tasks reparations with repairing present harms to individuals or groups that are caused or constituted by past harms. So the basic thing is it's trying to make people better off. The people who are receiving reparations should be moved from one level of life chances and welfare to a higher one. That is supposed to involve treating people differently based on assigning them to different categories. It's a kind of view of harm that is very consonant with tort law or injury law. And as a result, the categories are similar to how those forms of law would split people up into, whether we're thinking about plaintiffs or defendants or identity categories like whites versus black or settler versus indigenous, depending on who we're thinking about reparations for. These are supposed to be the same kinds of splits of people as other splits of people into those advantaged by the history of racial capitalism, of global racial empire, and those disadvantaged by that history, which is also supposed to be the same kind of split between those descended from the enslavers and those descended from the enslaved, or those descended from the colonizers and those descended from the indigenous and dispossessed. For a variety of reasons, I think there's a lot of complications in trying to make those all the same kinds of categories. I'm just raising that in case people want to talk about it later. But for now, I'll just content myself with discussing the standards. I think harm repair arguments do a great job on standard 1. They're just about making tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. And they certainly discriminate. They assign different people different roles. Some people receive reparations and some people are giving reparations. But I think they don't do as good a job as another view, hence the constructive view, at responding to the core wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, because I'm understanding those core wrongs as not just doing harm to people, but also setting up a distributive system that itself represents the ongoing provision of those harms, ongoing inequalities in how knowledge gets produced and where it goes, and how wealth gets produced and where it goes, and how pollution gets produced and where it goes. It's those channels, those pipelines of social advantage and disadvantage that I think are among the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism that we can still address. And one-off transfers of money or land don't necessarily get that job done. So not as well, doesn't do as good a job on standard 2, does well on 1 and 3. The second form of reparations argument that I think about is called the relationship repair view. Reparations should repair damage to relationships between groups that are caused or constituted by past wrongdoing. So we could think of this in terms of the relationship between a moral creditor and debtor. somebody just discharging a moral obligation, or we could think of it a more straightforwardly normative way of thinking about moral relationships. We need to give reparations to confirm and communicate that we share normative standards and same moral standards so that we can live on peaceable moral terms with each other. But neither one of these, it's the relationship between communities, perhaps African-American descendants of the enslaved and the United States federal government, perhaps Black citizens and white citizens, perhaps Indigenous citizens and settlers. I shouldn't say citizens, Indigenous people and settlers. But relationships between groups or between groups and institutions are the things that are supposed to be repaired on this view. One objection that I think is important to this way of thinking about reparations is that some ways of construing the reparations might change the subject. As Coleman Hughes puts it on the right, Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. So the communicative way of thinking about it, or some ways of thinking about the mere discharge of a moral obligation, might distract from the things that we really should be doing, which is building decent, dignified livelihoods, affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. I think the relationship repair view does discriminate. It asks for debt payments or apologies or communications from some people and calls on other people to receive those. But it doesn't do too well on the first two. It doesn't necessarily make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives, especially when interpreted symbolically. And it doesn't address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. It doesn't necessarily change the pipelines of social advantage and disadvantage to the extent that we understand those as maybe having normative dimensions, but also having lots of other dimensions, technical dimensions, institutional dimensions, so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily change how institutions operate and who they reward. So my preferred view is this third one, the constructive view. On this view, what reparations should do is create tomorrow's just world. And what reparations is about the just distribution of the cost of transition from today's injustice to tomorrow's justice. That view tasks reparations with construction rather than repair. As a result, it is a distributive approach rather than an approach rooted in retributive justice or even morally restorative justice. We need to look forward if we want to decide where reparations should take us, the kind of target state of affairs, what the just world would be like. But we look backward when we're trying to figure out who should be on the hook for getting us there from here, and to what extent they should be on the hook for getting us there from here. The constructive view, as much as I wish it was perfect and did everything right, the ranking of the standards makes a difference because I don't think the constructive view will scratch everyone's moral itches. I think the constructive view does make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives insofar as social structure and the kinds of distributive pipelines of social advantages and disadvantages are the material conditions of people's lives to a large extent, they are the material conditions of people's lives. And I think this view addresses the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, insofar as the building of this unjust distributive system is a core moral wrong of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, but it doesn't necessarily discriminate. If we change the world, we change it for everyone, not just for the people who have been most disadvantaged and most preyed upon by the world as we've built it now. And so I think it doesn't discriminate quite as well as the other two views do. One thing that people often raise against this view is the idea that it's not a view of reparations at all. It's just a view about achieving justice. And any old I don't know, political ideal theory of what the just world is like will tell you what we should achieve in terms of making a just social system. But reparations accounts are backward looking rather than forward looking, as those ideal accounts might be, especially theories of what distributive justice would be forward looking. Here's how we should in the future come to distribute money or land or some other focal resource. I think this division is artificial. I think social structure is an accumulated result of social processes. Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say. And if we have a historical processual view of distributive justice, Nozick is a good example of this in philosophical literature, then we'll see that actually addressing the unjust distributions of the past that have sedimented themselves into disproportionate access to healthcare, housing, wealth today, will involve looking backwards to see how those got so disproportionate and figuring out a way of making them more egalitarian or more consonant with whatever our picture of justice in the future is. The way that we should get there should be informed by our assessment of the past. So one question to answer, distribution of what? What is it that we should distribute? Some views that you could broadly call resourcist views think that distributive justice is primarily about making sure everyone has the same or some otherwise just amount of stuff. What that stuff is depends on your theory more granularly. Some people think income or wealth is the thing that needs to be equally distributed or justly distributed to have distributive justice. Some take a more comprehensive view, like the political philosopher John Rawls, who thinks primary goods, in particular social primary goods, should be equitably distributed. And that's the kind of thing that will get us, give us headway towards achieving justice on a more grand scale. I prefer a view pioneered by philosophers Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, which is called the capabilities view, which takes it that what we need to give to people are capabilities, which are capacities to achieve functioning. That's just a fancy way of saying we need to make it possible for people to do things. One way to make it possible for people to do things is to give them resources. Right? One way to make it possible for people to eat is to give them money, which they can exchange for food. But the capabilities view makes us alive to the whole host of possibilities by which we can make people capable of achieving that functioning. We could distribute resources like dollars, or we could distribute other things like affordances. Here I'm taking my lessons from the universal design movement and related scholarship in disability justice. But it's actually the built social environment itself and the affordances that are built into it that we could change if we want to achieve just distributions. Let me make this a little simpler. If you want to make something easier to carry, you could give it a handle. That is, you could change the object in a way that makes it more usable by a wider range of people in a particular way. That is, to give a thing you want people to carry a handle is to distribute an affordance, is to make a thing usable in a particular kind of way. As you can hopefully tell, this is of some importance from the perspective of disability justice. Stairs in front of a building or ramps in front of a building are not things that are personal property of any particular person, but they are affordances. They decide which people with a rich range of abilities can enter that building. And how stairs and ramps are distributed are important determinants of the ways that people can live their lives in ways that aren't well captured by the resourcist way of looking at the world. Some of the affordances, ways that we can make parts of our social system usable that we should be thinking about are directly governance related. Elections are one way that we can make decision-making power usable by people, but there are other ways that we can make decision-making levers of power more usable by people. We could build different kinds of affordances. Those correspond to different kinds of political structures. We can choose our legislators by lottery, as in latocracy, rather than by elections, which can be bought and gamed by the well-positioned, well-resourced, and moneyed in our societies. And we should expect that different kinds of distributions of political power, which are made possible by distributing political affordances in a different way, will safeguard different people's interests. We should want to set these things up in a way that give people self-determination, meaningful power over their own lives, and an ability to live with each other on a planetary scale on terms of equality. I'll have a little bit more to say about both of those in a second, but right now I want to emphasize that these are design objectives. We're not talking about abstract moral principles by which we just affirm or condemn the political structures we have, but we're talking about the actual features by which our political structures respond or fail to respond to populations. We're talking about actual decision-making power over how things are distributed and how decisions get made in public and hopefully by the public. But it's that kind of concreteness that explains also why this fight has to be a climate fight. Why does racial justice and reparations have to do with climate justice? It has to do with the kind of practical commitments we've taken on, if you're with me, in taking on the constructive view. If what we're trying to do is literally remake the world, to try to change the affordances and the systems of distribution that characterize our world, then we have embarked on a practical project. And like any practical project, we have to overcome the practical hurdles that stand between us and the completion of that project. If we wanted to build a house, or a school, if you like, we would need to ask practical questions. Does the land where we want to build the school, can it support the weight of the school? Do we have access to the right kinds of materials? Are we in the right kind of environment for completing that project? And it is that sense, that practical sense, in which I think we should ask about climate and the contribution of climate justice. What will it profit a parent to be able to send their children to an affordable school that is burned to the ground by wildfires or underwater from sea level rise? That's just a way of asking materially the abstract theoretical question of how we will protect or improve upon the precarious gains of previous racial justice struggles in a world 3 or 4 degrees warmer without comprehensive climate justice. In the past, when I started working on this project, I feel like these links were less popular now, but more and more, I feel as though it's becoming common sense. So I'll just quickly say that one way climate crisis could go if the present political structures and our present distributive system stays in place is in the direction of climate apartheid, where the rich, and I would add racially advantaged, largely escape overheating, hunger, and conflict through their disproportionate access to things like wealth and political power. These can exacerbate existing social divisions between countries and communities at the community level, which you might call climate apartheid, or even at the geopolitical level between states, which you might call climate colonialism. But either way, it's a worsening of distributive outcomes based on the way that we've already built the distributive system. So racial justice on this view, as a reminder, is about how this distributive system operates, who it makes secure and who it renders vulnerable, who it affords political power, who it directs resources and money to. And changing those things is key to racial justice. I think, ideally, a climate reparations program would respond to these distributions in a historically informed way. It would be less a particular policy and more a program, more an approach to the ecosystem, to the diverse kinds of policies that we have to have. If you study climate policy a little bit, you probably recognize the categories listed below, whether it's mitigation or the policy things that we do to prevent emissions, adaptations, the things that we do to respond to the ramifications of emissions we failed to prevent, loss and damage, how we respond to the damage from climate crises we've failed to prevent, resettlement of people who are displaced by climate crisis, carbon removal. These are all areas of climate policy. And in general, climate reparations would call for distributing the burdens of these policies towards the global north and the racially advantaged, and the benefits towards the global south and the racially disadvantaged, Black and Indigenous populations. We can get even more specific than that. The gold standard of reparations discussions is mailing people checks, giving people cash, the unconditional cash transfer, if you prefer a wonkier way of putting it. But this is the gold standard for a reason. It's an extremely direct way to change who has claim rights on the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. And we should just do it. There are a number of technical objections to particular ways of doing it, but I think these are better as cautionary tales about how this should be done rather than objections to whether it should be done. In particular, Sandy Garrity and Kirsten Mullen have given what I think is a very sound proposal about how African-American descendants of the enslaved in the United States could get reparations, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we should just do. Unconditional cash transfers would be among the things that redistribute money and resources, and so have pride of place as an extremely important aspect of climate justice, understood as part and parcel of reparations and reparatory justice. But I think there are also ways to redistribute power directly, political power, decision-making power, in ways that likewise meet this ethos. I'll just give you a couple examples just to set up Q&A. One is participatory budgeting, which I like to talk about. It was piloted in Porto Alegre, Brazil by the Brazilian Workers' Party. And it's a form of governance that puts direct democratic power into the hands of people in something like a town hall format to decide how public resources, public funds get used. It's been used at a small scale in New York City. It's been used at a larger scale in places like Kerala in India. But it's a way of giving marginalized people a direct say in their government and a direct say in the decisions made over what to do with public resources. It's not magic. It is vulnerable to various kinds of problems, and the scale of money committed to participatory budgeting efforts is a scale on their political potential. But all that means is that we should put more money into processes like these, maybe all of the money into processes like these. A similar kind of change to decision-making that we could make given reparatory justice is community control over power, or what some people call energy democracy. That would involve taking decisions over how energy is to be provided out of the hands of investors and shareholders which tend to center profit and externalize environmental costs by dumping them on marginalized communities, and then turn that profit into political power and influence. This is the story, by the way, of why we have not had successful global climate efforts so far. We could respond to that by giving people direct control over how energy is produced and how it's distributed. State ownership, public ownership would be a part of that, but that's also a structure that can be captured by elites. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the people living under control of state resources have meaningful control over how and on what terms energy is produced and provided. So community level control is an important aspect of this as well. But there's a clown car of other ideas that could be part of reparations. We could reallocate special drawing rights, which are cash-like coupons given out by the International Monetary Fund. We could sign global non-proliferation treaties of fossil fuels as part of ensuring a just transition out of them. Rich countries could actually contribute the money they promised to the Green Climate Fund and much more than that. If we were worried about getting the money together for all of these things, perhaps we should embrace modern monetary theory, and perhaps it doesn't matter as much as we think, or perhaps it does, in which case we should just reform the tax havens where the very richest people of the world are making off with trillions of dollars of the wealth that comes from social cooperation. But I'm just listing all of these to give you a sense of how expansive world making requires us to be, and how large the terrain is on which we need to contest all of these things. That is just to say what I said to you at the beginning, that reparations requires climate justice, and that requires literally remaking the world. But I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to talking with you all in Q&A. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Femi. You covered a lot of territory and presented that argument really clearly. And I think that people, I'm sure, really benefited from hearing it. So please put your questions in the Q&A. And while I am waiting for some questions to be collected in the Q&A, I would love to begin with a question, and maybe a clarificatory question, but also I'm totally convinced that world making and the constructive view is excellent, and in fact kind of covers a lot of the needs and the both sort of the moral and the practical needs that the harm repair and relationship repair approaches emphasize. But I wasn't sure what happened to the idea of repair. So I got kind of excited about relationship repair, especially, and thinking about like truth commissions for around climate change, which we totally need, because there's also this sort of, you know, just like, I love that you opened with a rejection of nihilism. So first of all, thank you so much as somebody who works in environmental philosophy. So I think that's so important to make that point, and to make that point in relation to the successes of the decolonial movements is fantastic. But there is something about that, the work of repair. I mean, are you seeing it as part of world making? The methods that you listed under repair seemed like really great methods to bring to climate justice action. And so I didn't want them to just sort of evaporate under the constructive view. So could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, you know, so let me say a larger thing first. The relationship of the constructive view versus the harm repair view and the relationship repair view is more of a kind of swamping argument. So I'm more trying to say the constructive view kind of encompasses what each of these does, but also gets at things that they leave aside. But there is something of a particular overcorrection from the relationship repair view, in that I very much foreground the kinds of things that harm repair view theorists would say. Like I start with the cash transfer, harm repair theorists are usually on board with that. Or I talk about other things that are transfer Z, right? Like FDR reallocation or something like that. And the reason for that is kind of rhetorical. It's not so much that I don't think that truth and reconciliation kinds of events have their role. I think they have a very important role, and that culture is very much a part of why our system works in the way that it does. And truth and what people recognize is very part of how the world works in the way that it does. But I feel like I worry, I'll put it that way, I worry that when people start there, they tend to naturalize as necessary parts of the social system, things that are contingent results of the particular way that our social system works because of power imbalances. So Kwame Ture has a really nice way of putting it. He said once, apocryphally, that if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. And that's a way of kind of cleanly getting the inside out there. You know, it's not as though no one accepts the truth that ExxonMobil was complicit with climate denial, or that no one is prepared to act on that truth. It's that the people who aren't prepared to act on that truth are extremely overrepresented in the levers, next to the levers of power and in the halls of power. And it's that contingent reality that represents the total problem of climate denial, and not, you know, the abstract notion of what is true about climate science, or what people as a whole, irrespective of their social position, really are willing to admit about climate science, or so on and so forth. And so I just want to, I'm responding to an environment where I feel as though people take democracy a little more seriously than the ruling class does.
Thanks. That helps kind of clarify. I also think, though, that repair, to just sort of keep breathing some life in repair, because also repair of relationships with nature. And the, you know, kind of what, I don't know if it's trivializing to ask like what reparations are due nature or something like, you know, and I know that that's like not sort of the sort of straightforward calculus approach that you're after, but you know, but the work certainly, you know, evokes that kind of question. Okay, so here's another question from an attendee. Does the constructive view require a global and national initiative from the government, or are there smaller steps we can take on the community and local levels to make a real impact?
Yeah, I think it would be hard, you know, outside of an extremely revolutionary context, which maybe is just what's required. But it would be hard to move politics at the scale that we need without some participation of either the state system itself or the resources that are currently hoarded by actors in the state system. But I think that doesn't mean that we can't get involved at the local and community level. And in fact, I think our best shot of getting anything done at the global and national level will have to come from pressure from community and local level efforts. In particular, things that I'm really encouraged by are the successes of divestment movements and the kind of ideological successes of movements against racist police violence. I think if there's some kind of combination of those energies, then you get real pressure on the powers that be to change things. And it's not just pressure campaigns. It's also community level investment in renewables. That's the kind of thing that can change the calculus, even for huge planetary scale asset managers, right? Who keep track of which things are reputational risks for them, or which things are risk long litigation, which things could present benefits for them from a PR perspective if they look like they're involved, right? And all those things are things that community level groups are in a position to push. Like, can you get investors out of your energy supply, out of your water supply, out of your housing? And can you set up better democratic ways of doing those things? If you can do that anywhere, I think that's worth doing. And I think it's a major advance for justice everywhere.
Okay, another question that looks like kind of a follow-up to the question that I asked. So some more thinking about repair. You argue for the constructive view for reparations over the relationship repair view and the harm repair view, but you admit that the constructive view might not capture all of the ethical concerns that many have. What about a pluralist view that offers a pluralist account of the function and purpose of reparations? For example, repairing harm plus constructing a just world, or something like that. I guess I still wonder whether the constructive view gets at the particular kinds of repair relations that some people care deeply about.
Yeah, I think in general, I would be very amenable to a pluralist view. I think that's a good idea. Partially because you can imagine, and you don't even have to imagine, there just are reparations campaigns for things of a smaller level. And I don't mean smaller in terms of importance. I just mean literally, parts of that fit into the whole history, right? There's a reparations movement for the particular massacre in Tulsa. There's reparations movements for for the German Empire's colonial genocide, for the Belgian Empire's colonial genocide, for France's colonial genocide, for the US's colonial genocide. And those are different movements, and the constructive view might not be the best articulation of each of those individually. It might not get at everything that people want out of those movements individually. And so I think I'm very friendly to the suggestion that a pluralist view might be good in general, even if at the planetary scale, the constructive view might be the way to go. That's because there's other scales worth looking at, and I don't mean to, I mean for the constructive view to be additive more than a replacement for other ways of thinking about reparations. I think it is just true that global politics tends to change in waves. The United States, Haitian, French, and Mexican revolutions, as well as many other Latin American revolutions, all happened within the same 40 to 50 year time span. The national independence movements of much of Asia and Africa after the Second World War happened within the same few decades time span. I think we often pretend as though different movements for justice are competitors when they're really complements. Justice moves in waves, and victory over there, not always, but more often than not, is a win for justice everywhere, even over here.
Great point. We're okay. So let's have some more questions in the Q&A. We don't have any questions at the moment, but luckily I have another question. And this will be just sort of like this is a little time filler while other people write up some questions. It seems to me that your description of world making as a response to climate change aligns pretty tightly with indigenous climate justice movements that are, it seems like you could argue that they are working for, reparations under another name. And that's sort of totally woven into what even the conceptualization of what the injustice is, and then, kind of what the demands are for climate justice. Do you think that's right?
I think that's totally right, right? It's one of the things I wanted to be careful about in talking through it in the book. I think at the end of the day, it's for that movement to tell me to what extent I succeeded. But that was very much in mind, right? The land back movement, for example, I think it is the same kind of ethos, or at the very least, I think that's something that reparatory justice would need to be compatible with. And the example that I give in the book of the constructive view is a particular Black nationalist group, the Republic of New Africa, who took a very importantly consonant approach to the reparations they demanded. They demanded that the United States cede its claim to particular land in the South, Black Belt states, and furnish the Republic of New Africa with money, and do those two things, not to cede that land directly to the Republic of New Africa, but to give the Republic of New Africa an opportunity to negotiate with indigenous peoples over what to do with that land. And I think it's that kind of move towards solidarity and cooperation that we need to do on a planetary scale. And it's the best example I could think of how those two movements in particular, but how justice more generally in search of the constructive view should work.
All right, thank you. So here's a question. In the practical application of the constructive view, how are opportunities such as housing and education distributed in America? Expanding affirmative action and affordable housing programs, similar to what we've seen, or something more revolutionary?
I would think, I would definitely think something more revolutionary, but I would also, I would err a word of caution in terms of a blueprint, which is just to say that this makes, it's good that this is the question after the one where we talk about about the land back movement and indigenous activism, because those are exactly the kinds of important complications I think should temper us from being too committed to a particular blueprint, right? Who should get to control housing and what should get to control housing would be, means something different in Oklahoma than it means in DC, than it means in Massachusetts, and all of those mean something different than they would mean in Ontario or than they would mean in Ghana. But I think broadly, things that I would expect to show up in different blueprints would be large, low carbon increases of housing stock that were publicly financed and publicly owned. And that were built in energy efficient manners. I would think that a much tighter regulatory apparatus, if not entirely eliminating the ways in which housing stock has been used as an investment vehicle, rather than in ways that were made to solve the problem of having a place to live, which you might think housing was for. But asset managers have news for you, I suppose. Yeah, we should do something about that. There are really great people who study housing who can give you much more granular ideas than I could, but I would be thinking in a more radically different direction than the one that we have.
All right, here's another question. You talked about certain large-scale governance ideas, programs like nationalizing fossil fuel companies and creating trust funds necessary for wealth reparations. I think some may feel that allowing governmental control over funds creates the danger of exploitation or cheating people out of reparations. So, is it more relevant to focus on creating community control systems now or starting reparation programs within our current systems of government? Or is this just something we can do at the same time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the order in which we do things definitely matters. And this is also a place where context matters. And I just think this comes down to how kleptocratic your regime is. And there are parts of the world where forms of public accountability are reasonably effective. And in those parts of the world, I think you could well start with nationalization of energy systems and start by creating funds at the nation state level and simultaneously make inroads for reparatory justice at the community level. I think in places where public forms of accountability are less effective, you might need to start at the grassroots level and work your way up. But I definitely, I appreciate the kind of practical bent of the question, and I think that's the right perspective to take. It's, what are the likely consequences of this strategy in this order rather than some other order?
Just a quick follow-up question. And then there's just one more question after that. But I think this is a good follow-up. How would you address the worry that reparations might legitimate national and global actors that have been responsible for the historical harms and oppression that reparations are trying to address?
I think there is a worry there. I'm not sure how likely that scenario is, right? Because at the end of the day, reparations would generate some positive PR after, because a country did the reparations, but it would also amount to a tacit admission of the scale of the crimes, which offsets, right? So I'm not sure, you could imagine, of course, the view of charity outweighing, I suppose, the historical harm, but it wouldn't be my first guess about how the social system, how the social world would respond to a serious reparations program. But even if it did, at the end of the day, my bias is towards the material circumstances of people's lives as the most important thing. So if the Niger Delta gets a serious infusion of cash and gets serious ecological cleanup, I will trade, clean water for the Ogoni people and farmable land for a good PR news cycle for Royal Dutch Shell. I think that's a trade worth making, and we should all be willing to make that trade-off.
Okay, great. A final question about capabilities. I'd like to hear more about what work the capabilities approach is doing within your constructive view. In particular, it seems that climate change is changing what we are capable of doing in each location. Climate change is directly affecting our affordances. Does this complicate the capabilities approach, and how does it change how we construct a just world?
Thanks for that question, Sarah. I guess I wouldn't say, how should I put this? I don't think it complicates the constructive approach. I think it demonstrates why the constructive approach needs reparations needs to be about climate justice, right? Because if the grounds for evaluating whether or not the constructive approach has succeeded or failed are our capabilities, and you're trying to expand people's capabilities, and climate justice is trying to is contracting them, then climate justice is presenting a challenge to the goals of constructive reparations on the terms of constructive reparations. Right? So it helps sharpen what the practical connection is between the constructive view of reparations as an attempt to expand people's capabilities and the climate crisis as a danger to people's capabilities.
And then a final question. Considering the practical application of your view, do you think there is an order regarding which groups need to or should receive reparations first?
I don't think there's an order as a theoretical matter. I think it's a practical political question, right? So it would make sense for Black and Indigenous groups who have been the most affected in various parts of the world to get reparations first. But that's not, I don't take it to be a theoretical point. I take it to be in the world of kind of activist realpolitik, what the way of dealing with that should be.
Pragmatist to the end. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Táíwò, thank you so much for this really stimulating talk and for answering so many questions. Are there any final words you would like to leave us with?
Just thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thanks for hosting, Professor Cuomo. Happy to be here.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good Wednesday night, and be sure to check out the other Georgia Global Georgia events and the other African American History Month events that are listed on the Willson Center website.